Hello, my name is Mason Fedino, and I'm going to share with you all a paper my colleagues and I published earlier this year in Ecological Applications titled Integrated Species Distribution Models Reveal Spatiotemporal Patterns of Human-Wildlife Conflict. Human-wildlife interactions are part of the human experience for people worldwide. And while most of these interactions can be positive or neutral, some of these can be negative. And human-wildlife conflict, for example, has led to things like species extinction, loss of human life, a lot of livestock depredation, and a significant amount of property damage in the billions and billions of dollars. Because of this, finding ways to mitigate human-wildlife conflict is really important for both humans and for wildlife. Yet, to mitigate human-wildlife conflict, I guess it's kind of important to know where and when human-wildlife conflict actually occurs. However, the data that we have in hand to actually try to parse out what we know about human-wildlife conflict does have its own set of limitations. For example, human-wildlife conflict data is often just presence only. We only know where conflict occurs. It's also often opportunistic, and because of that, there tends to be varying levels of data quality that's present within these data. Another limitation that is not often discussed is that current presence-only modeling approaches don't account for variation in a species distribution on the landscape. Simply put, if a species does not occupy a portion of the landscape, conflict cannot occur at that location. So in this raccoon example, the identical trash can on the left will not be generating conflict, while the trash can within the raccoon's distribution could. To estimate a species' probability of conflict relative to their own distribution, we actually extended this model by Koshkina et al., which came out in 2017. Now, I'm not going to be sharing any mathematical notation here. The model itself has a fair bit to unpack, and I encourage those who are interested in it to look at the Koshkina et al. Paper. There's three different inputs basically to this model. It starts with presence-only data or presence background data. One example of that would be data from public participatory science. And then also you have more rigorously collected detection, non-detection data at a sort of subset of locations. And on top of that, you have some sort of spatial covariates. Now, all three of these inputs can actually be used to estimate parameters associated to species occupancy across the modeled landscape. In addition, there is a separate level to the model to estimate detection probability from the more rigorously collected detection, non-detection data, like say, for example, camera trap data. And finally, there is one last level to the model that helps identify the spatial bias that exists within the presence-only data. But depending upon the type of opportunistic presence-only data that you use, that bias could actually be ecologically relevant. Say, for example, we input known locations of human-wildlife conflict. Then all of a sudden, that spatial bias term is actually related to where that species is most likely to come into conflict, assuming they occupy the entire landscape. So the conflict that you actually observe on the landscape, C here, is actually the product of a species presence as well as their conflict potential, A and B. And to demonstrate this new or alternative use case of the Koshkina et al. Model, I'm going to share the results from a case study where we explore the influence of different gradients on the distribution and conflict potential of coyote, opossum, and raccoon throughout Chicago, Illinois. Since about 2010, my colleagues and I at the Lincoln Park Zoo have been camera trapping 4 times a year. And all these little white dots you actually see are where our camera traps are located from the heart of downtown Chicago outwards about 50 kilometers. The data in hand that we have for this project includes all of our camera trapping locations throughout the city of Chicago, so 43 of our roughly 110 cameras. And then we're using data from 12 month-long deployments between 2011 and 2013. For the conflict data, we made a FOIA request to the city of Chicago and received about 7,000 reported conflicts made to the Chicago Animal Care and Control between 2011 and 2013. And these data include a mixture of calls that did and did not require intervention, meaning that could be that someone just called in a coyote because they saw it, or they could have a raccoon in their attic or their bathroom, et cetera, et cetera. In addition to the camera trap data and the human wildlife conflict data, we also included a number of spatial covariates within this model. So first off, we took canopy cover, housing density, impervious cover, and grass cover throughout the city of Chicago, which are all pretty strongly correlated to one another. And we created two urban intensity metrics with these variables using principal components analysis. This first urban intensity metric essentially represents a gradient of urbanization. So from negative to positive, from darker colors to lighter colors in this figure on the left here. It's basically the landscape is changing from areas with greater tree cover to areas with greater impervious cover and housing density. This second urban intensity metric essentially captures a gradient of bare ground, so impervious cover or grass cover when negative, these darker values, to areas with more tree cover and housing density at the same time when positive, these sort of lighter colors that we actually see here on this figure. In addition to these two urban intensity metrics, we incorporated two social gradients throughout Chicago, and that includes per capita income throughout the city, as well as home vacancies throughout the city during that same exact time period, so between 2011 and 2013. Now, here are the results from two different levels of the model. On the left side, we have species occupancy, or their latent distribution. And on the right side, we have a species conflict potential as estimated from the human wildlife conflict data. So conflict potential, sort of a weird term, but essentially it is where the spatial bias is in the conflict data, assuming essentially that the species occupies the entire landscape. If we just want to look at the greatest hits, let's just focus up in the top right corner here. So we see that for all three species, essentially, as increasing levels of URB2 occur throughout the landscape. So as canopy cover and housing density increase at the same time, we see that the conflict potential for all three of these species really greatly and strongly increases. So basically, where wildlife habitat and human habitat overlap, that's where these species are getting into conflict. And finally, we've got some rather intriguing results with the opossum and raccoon as a function of income. We see on the left side of this figure here that opossum and raccoon occupancy actually decreases with increasing levels of income throughout the city. But despite this, we're actually seeing more reported conflicts throughout the city with higher levels of income. What this actually means, I'm not going to get into right now, but I will discuss it in just a second. In addition to estimating these parameters, the model lends itself really well to plotting out these relationships as you need to evaluate the model across the entire landscape, so you already have the data in hand. So this is just the expected occupancy of coyote, opossum, and raccoon throughout the entire study over those 12 sampling periods. And on top of that, we have the conflict potential. So where the species is likely to get reported in the event that they are sort of observed by someone throughout the city. So you could see with the coyote, yellow means higher probability. It's essentially 1 in this case. If a coyote is observed, they are essentially reported wherever they're at. And we see a slight bit more variation with the opossum and with the raccoon results. And as a reminder, a species' realized conflict on the landscape is the product of their occupancy and their conflict potential. And coyote's conflict potential was essentially 1 across the entire model landscape, and therefore where this species is reported in terms of human-wildlife conflict essentially just tracks their distribution throughout the city. We see that is generally the case for the opossum as well. So once again, we've got occupancy on the left side here, and then realized conflict on the right side. There's slight bits of variation. And the same exact thing can be said for the raccoon. So essentially, where these wildlife live is for the most part where they get into conflict. But there are a few other takeaways as well. First, basically human-wildlife conflict is most likely to occur where human and wildlife habitat overlap. And we aren't the first people to find this. There's over a decade worth of research that demonstrates this pattern across many different urban areas. Say, for example, coyote in Denver, human-wildlife conflict in general throughout most of New York, and humans and black bears throughout Missoula, Montana. So this should be essentially a general rule, I would say. Another result I wanted to discuss a bit further is that raccoon and opossum had higher conflict in high income areas but lower occupancy. And this may actually demonstrate that the human wildlife conflict data that we actually have um, may have its own sorts of biases that need to be unpacked on their own. Say, for example, that income tends to be positively correlated with trust in local government. And so it could just be that these results are actually an artifact of this. It could be that conflict happens all the time in low income areas, but no one is reporting it. And this can actually be a really big problem because Chicago actually uses these complaints to focus their management efforts. So if low income areas are not reporting, then management is not being equitably distributed. So how could we actually identify these biases that are present in conflict data? To do this, ecologists need to collaborate more with people outside of our field, namely social scientists. In order to identify people's willingness to report conflict, for example, across socioeconomic boundaries, we need to go out and talk to people in very structured ways so we can actually incorporate such information into a model like this. In closing, this integrated model can help mitigate human-wildlife conflict for three reasons. First, knowing where conflict happens allows us to strategically use different management strategies. Second, it actually is leveraging data that city officials already use, which should make it easier to work with city wildlife managers. And then finally, because the model gets evaluated across the entire landscape, it's really, really easy to make maps from the model output. And in closing, I just want to thank all of the landowners around Chicago who have let us survey wildlife for over a decade. You can find me on Twitter at Mason Fedino, and also my colleagues and I at the Urban Wildlife Institute at the Lincoln Park Zoo at LPZ_UWI. All data and code to recreate this analysis can be found on my GitHub repository, Conflict. And then also, I just want to do a plug for my website that also has access to all of my research that I've been doing, but also includes lots of ecological modeling blog posts, including one specifically on this model. So if you want more of a gentle introduction to how to do this, that is where I would tell you to look. Thank you.